early 1800s, from my home state of Maine, there was a man named Elijah Lovejoy. Now, Elijah was a passionate man, and he found himself deeply rooted in the desire to root out the injustices of his day. Now, in Elijah's time, of course, it was the North Atlantic slave trade and American slavery that was the deepest injustice. But Elijah was on the minority side, and he realized that he needed to stand up for the voiceless, and he needed to tell the story of those who had been enslaved in the United States. And so while Elijah didn't have access to a lot of resources, he wasn't overly famous or anything like that. Elijah knew that the one thing that he could do was use modern media to expose this modern injustice. And so Elijah went out and he bought himself a printing press, and he started his own newsletter. And he took his pleas for the end of slavery from his pulpit out into the American square and began talking about this in his public newsletter. Now, Elijah, as you can imagine, wasn't a very popular man. At least 3 times, pro-slavery mobs broke into his warehouse, took his printing press, broke it into pieces, and threw it into the river. He and some friends were guarding his 4th printing press at a warehouse when a pro-slavery mob surrounded the warehouse and demanded that they come out and surrender the printing press. Well, Lovejoy refused, and so the angry mob set fire to the building. And as Lovejoy climbed up to the top of the roof to try to put out the flames, he was shot 5 times and ultimately buried on his 35th birthday. You see, Lovejoy knew that one of the keys to ending this injustice was to expose it. He knew that the best way to get rid of darkness is to shine light into it. And so he brought this modern media, the printing press, and he used it to expose the injustice of slavery. Now, of course, 175 years later, while we don't see it in the same ways that Lovejoy did, we actually live in a world where slavery is more prevalent and more common than it was during the North Atlantic slave trade. There's not a nation in the world that is untouched by modern slavery and human trafficking. And while Lovejoy actually lost his life telling the story, his inspiration lived on. In fact, he was mentioned in one of Abraham Lincoln's first speeches that are ever recorded in history. You see, I have a heart for Lovejoy because, like him, I'm a 35-year-old man from Maine who has a passionate desire to bring modern media to expose the modern injustice of slavery in our time. And so a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to go to India with a few of my friends, and we wanted just to build some basic relationships and begin exploring how deeply human trafficking and modern slavery is impacting the nation of India. And what we found was amazing. I was able to conduct a class with young at-risk girls who were in the highest risk categories of being trafficked into slavery and explain to them some of the things that they could do to keep themselves safe. I met with girls who were former slaves, sold into slavery for as little as 10 American dollars at the age of 11 and only rescued many years later. They're beautiful stories in that they're stories of rescue, but their stories are rare. I've also met with mothers who have lost their daughters to slavery and never heard from them again. Or brothers who haven't seen their sisters in years because they just disappeared into the slave trade. And so throughout that trip was born the idea of Project Lovejoy, Destination India. Like Lovejoy, I'm going to bring modern media to expose the modern injustices of our time. In Project Lovejoy Destination India, we'll be traveling back to India to start a photo documentary of the faces of trafficking to show you the families that have been impacted, the girls that have been rescued, and those who have been so deeply moved by this issue. We will be traveling all the way up through the border region of Nepal, where thousands of girls are trafficked into the sex trade each year because they fetch a much higher price because of their skin tone. We'll be going into the tea gardens, where these unscheduled tribes are at especially high risk of finding themselves in modern slavery because of the unprotections they receive from those around them. And so when we come back, we will begin telling this story with the footage that we gather. We will be traveling to churches and civic groups, and we will begin telling the story of modern slavery in our time. As a professional photographer, I'm used to telling stories that are beautiful and wonderful, stories that should be told and need to be told. But like Lovejoy, I am also aware that the story of injustice is one that must be told. There are people in the world that have no voice. There is darkness that needs light shown into it. And there is justice that needs to be brought to the injustice of modern slavery. Like Lovejoy, I know that the one thing I can do is I can bring modern media to expose a modern injustice. Thanks for partnering with me, Project Lovejoy, Destination India.